70% of wealthy families lose everything by the third generation, not because they made bad investments. Not because of bad luck, because they made the same mistake every generation before them made. They left behind something that could be spent, and money that can be spent always gets spent. That's not pessimism, that's gravity. There's a version of you that has thought about this, maybe not in those exact words, but somewhere in a quieter moment the question surfaced, what am I actually building? Not for this year, not for this decade, but for the people who will exist in a world you never see. What survives you, what compounds without you, what holds when no one is watching anymore. Most people answer that question with a number. If I leave enough, it'll be fine. But Benjamin Franklin, sitting under a mulberry tree in Philadelphia in the last months of his life, barely able to move, watching time collapse, understood something that number thinking never reaches. More money wasn't the answer was something harder, quieter, and far more permanent than any balance in any account. When Franklin died in 1790, he left roughly $4,400, split between the cities of Boston and Philadelphia. That's not the interesting part. The interesting part is what he attached to that money. A set of restrictions so precise, so deliberately engineered against human nature that 200 years later, those $4,400 had become over $6.5 million and had funded schools, scholarships, and real opportunities for tens of thousands of people who weren't even born when Franklin picked up his pen. This is not a story about compound interest. Compound interest is just math. This is a story about architecture. And the difference between those two things is the difference between generational wealth that lasts decades and wealth that reshapes civilization long after you're gone. Here's what's already in motion, whether you're paying attention or not. Every day you build a balance without building a structure, you're creating something with an expiration date. Not because the people who come after you are irresponsible, but because unstructured money and unstructured time share the same fatal flaw. They always flow toward the path of least resistance. And the path of least resistance is always spending, never preserving. That's not a moral failure, it's physics. And physics wins unless you engineer something strong enough to resist it. Franklin knew this, so instead of trusting future generations to be disciplined, he trusted a lock. The restrictions in his will weren't generous, they were almost surgical. The money could not be touched for 100 years, not as a lump sum, not early, not for any emergency the managers might claim. It could only be lent to young tradesmen under the age of 26 at 5% annual interest, repaid over 10 years. No exceptions were written in, no flexibility was allowed. Franklin looked at human nature, at impulsiveness, at the well-intentioned failures he had witnessed his entire life, and designed a system that would work not because of human virtue, but in spite of human weakness. He wasn't trusting people, he was trusting the architecture. There were legal battles, multiple ones. In Boston, the city and the state fought over access to the money for years. Politicians pushed for early withdrawal, administrators lobbied for exceptions. The trust was challenged in court more than once, and the lock held, not because everyone involved was unusually principled. The lock held because Franklin had built the cost of breaking the rules directly into the structure itself, making compliance less painful than violation. So the system survived. And kept compounding, and kept producing impact long after every person who ever argued about it was gone. Here's what that means, not historically, but personally. Discipline that lives only inside your mind dies when you do. The conviction, the self-control, the values that took you decades to build, all of it is mortal. But discipline that you've installed into a structure, into the architecture of how your family operates, into the rules you've made non-negotiable before you were in a position to need them, that's the thing that compounds. That's the thing that survives. That's what the $2,000 actually was, not generosity, architecture. Most people who think about building a financial legacy think about amount. How much can I accumulate? What assets, what accounts, what portfolios, what returns? That's thinking about the tree. Franklin thought about the soil, about the root system, about the conditions that would allow a seed to keep growing even without the gardener, because you cannot bequeath willpower. You cannot inherit discipline. There is no legal document that transfers a mindset across generations. But you can build a structure, a deliberate, carefully designed architecture that forces future generations to behave as if they had the discipline you spent a lifetime developing. That's the real insight. The most powerful legacy isn't the one you leave, it's the one you install. Now comes the uncomfortable part, not the history, the mirror. It's easy to admire what Franklin built and walk away unchanged. It's easy to feel something watching $4,400 become millions, to nod at the wisdom, and then go on making the same decisions you made yesterday. But ask the question Franklin was asking when he sat under that mulberry tree, in pain, running out of time. Not how much do I have, but what have I built that would survive me? What structures in your family, in your finances, in the habits of the people closest to you hold even when you're not in the room? What patterns are you installing in people right now that will still be running 20 years from now when they make decisions you can't influence? For most people, the honest answer arrives as silence. Building systems feels abstract, slow, invisible in real time. You don't see the results for years, sometimes decades, sometimes you never see them at all. And that's the hardest part, the part most people avoid by focusing on accumulation instead, because accumulating feels productive. Building a lock feels like sacrifice without immediate reward. It requires accepting that the payoff may happen on a timeline you don't live to experience. It demands a kind of patience that looks, from the outside, almost like indifference. Franklin signed the final version of his will in the last year of his life, knowing with certainty that he would never see what it became. He was engineering for a future he would never inhabit. And that's the revelation that reorients everything. The most powerful financial decision you can make isn't about maximizing what you accumulate. It's about minimizing how much human weakness can dismantle what you've built. The families that preserve generational wealth don't do it by having more. They do it by designing systems stronger than the moments when having more makes spending easy. They build locks. They install structures more patient than desire, more permanent than any single generation's good intentions. Wealth without architecture is a countdown, and the counter is already running. Here is the shift, the one most people spend their entire lives postponing, from thinking about a financial legacy as a number to thinking about it as a system. From asking how much will I leave to asking what structure will I install, from building wealth to building the lock that protects it. You are not just building assets, you are building the conditions under which those assets either survive or disappear. Every choice you make about how you spend, how you save, how you talk about money with the people around you, every one of those choices is either reinforcing or eroding the architecture that will outlast you. And that architecture is being built right now, by design or by default. Franklin did this in the final months of his life with $4,400 and a clear mind. The question isn't whether you'll leave something behind. You will. The question is what kind of architecture that something is built on. Every wealthy family that watches its inheritance disappear by the third generation had someone once who worked for it, who was disciplined, who built something real, and then left behind money without leaving behind the lock. You don't have to repeat that story, but not repeating it requires a decision most people postpone until it's too late, building systems while you still have the time to make them strong. Installing the architecture while you're still here to install it, choosing what holds over what feels good right now. That's the real inheritance, not what you leave behind, what you build before you go.